This was kind of the good old days of science, when scientists injected new drugs into themselves. Yeah. So he discovered, after injecting it into himself, that it was quite clearly very, very psychedelic. This kind of rush of highly complex geometric imagery that kind of overwhelmed him, seized control of him. So he knew then that this was something special, something quite different to the drugs that were known at the time: LSD, mescaline, psilocybin. This seemed to kind of transcend that and transport you to some alternate reality. So he started injecting with the drug into colleagues, basically, who worked at the same hospital. And even in those very first studies, it was quite obvious that these individuals were not just being transported to other worlds, but these were populated worlds, and that there were what seemed to be kind of intelligent beings, including little diminutive creatures, multitudinous creatures, lively beings that now we would recognize as elves or machine elves in Terence McKenna parlance. But when Rick Strassman picked up the mantle in the early 90s, and he did a much larger study with 60 volunteers of various doses of DMT. And a not insignificant number of these individuals reported experiences that would not raise an eyebrow if they had appeared in books by John Mack. So kind of alien abduction type experiences where people are brought into some kind of highly sophisticated technological environment where there are beings, often a number of like orderlies, less senior beings, who are kind of performing the work, and you know, analyses and measurements, scanning and all this kind of stuff. And then often there was one like top dog who was kind of in the background but had a very strong presence, kind of overseeing or supervising the procedure. And then they'd often be taken on kind of a tour of this craft or technological place, meetings with highly intelligent, highly advanced, non-human beings, and then brought safely back into the normal waking world. And this kind of scenario is precisely what John Mack's abductees, or experiencers, as he used to call them, were kind of reporting. So it didn't escape John Mack's attention. And people were asking him, you know, have you heard about DMT? Because what you're talking about sounds a lot like what people are reporting under the influence of DMT. And I think, you know, Rick Strassman also said, you know, if we removed all references to DMT in many of the reports from my volunteers, would anyone be able to distinguish them from the reports of alien and abductees? And I think towards the end, you know, as John Mack progressed through his abduction career, if you want to put it like that, he became less convinced that this was a purely physical nuts and bolts phenomenon where people were actually being removed from their beds at night and taken onto actual physical crafts. But he started to feel like this was some kind of non-physical process. That many of his subjects reported going to environments that didn't seem to be physical. So places that had kind of higher dimensional spaces, beings that were very similar to the types of beings that people encounter in DMT. So he kind of shifted towards a more spiritual or metaphysical or non-physical explanation for these abduction experiences.
And a little context for the audience: John Mack was the head of the Harvard Psychiatry Department in the 90s. And he was actually childhood friends with a guy named Bud Hopkins, who was documenting a lot of these sort of abduction experiences. and he started to take a deep dive. He was actually friends with Thomas Kuhn, who wrote Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he was like, I don't know, maybe some of this alien stuff is real. And Kuhn was like, yeah, this, basically you should, try to maintain the null hypothesis for as long as possible. But even though you sit on a respectable perch at Harvard, you should actually dive into this. He started to dive into it. He started to take it very seriously. Yeah. He was like, these people are reporting events that they feel are very, very real. They have no mental health history prior or after. And so it's interesting that you say that he sort of, starts to view them as more spiritual or taking place in maybe a realm apart from the physical. He was also very inspired by Stanislav Grof and holotropic breath work, where the goal is actually to, I think, endogenously release DMT or something at the end of the breath work. And so if that's inspired Mac to that extent, and then Mac would use that in his practice with a lot of the abductees in order for them to recall their experiences, maybe that adds to your point. But I will say that some of these abductees have physical marks and things and implants and stuff where it's like do you have an explanation for that? Have you thought of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the line between the physical and the non-physical is not always clear cut,
yeah,
right? So it's like you can't really, it's hard to get at. There is obviously what we would consider to be a physical aspect, but there also seems to be a very non-physical aspect. And I just don't think we, as humans, we really understand. I think maybe if we were able to observe this from a higher perspective and kind of an overview, like a bird's eye view of reality, it might be obvious what's going on here. But I just think it's useful to be able to distinguish between the physical. It's kind of instructive to distinguish between the physical and the non-physical. But actually, sometimes, you point out, it's maybe a combination of the physical and the non-physical.
And I feel like people, like, if they were to point to a dividing line where the physical and the non-physical sort of divested, it would be Descartes or something in the kind of proverbial, But if you look at Descartes, like how that divestiture actually occurred is he was doing thought experiments about a demon controlling your entire perceptive epistemology in some almost, proto like VR headset that could be reality, and all you could know is that your own thoughts were yours or something. And so that's a pretty trippy thought.
It is, and I actually, that's kind of an interesting point, because Grof actually, in one of his books, he said, look, if there are advanced intelligent beings, aliens that are kind of non-physical, discarnate, everywhere and nowhere, then the way that they would appear to us would be dismissed as hallucination. They would kind of interact with our brain directly. They wouldn't have to kind of materialize, so to speak, in a true, quote unquote, physical form, but they would interact with us directly with our brain. And I think that's actually what's going on, whether it's Descartes' demon. But I think when you smoke DMT, for example, what I think is happening, or what I've come to believe or lean towards an explanation for what's happening, is that you have these intelligences that don't have a physical form. They don't have a form that could even be represented in any kind of visual form. These are completely non-physical, discarnate beings, but DMT somehow gives them access to our neural machinery, and so they are, I believe, directing the visions. I believe the DMT world to be what I call a directed world. I don't think you're going anywhere. I don't think you're peeking through into another world. Because that's not how perception works. Perception works by your brain building this model, which is then tested against sensory inputs from the environment. You never have direct access to the so-called external world or the environment. And it's the same in the DMT experience. You're not seeing the DMT world, whatever that might mean. You're simply giving access to these intelligent agents, giving them access to your brain. So you don't break through. I always say you don't break through into the DMT world. It's the DMT world, or the intelligence is within this space that break through into you.
Different parts of the brain have different activities.